Hello, everyone. I'm Arturo Wong, an instructor at Infinity Paragliding School. In this video, I'll explain how to distinguish a thermal from dynamic lift, so you can decide if you should spiral into a thermal or stay close to the mountain for dynamic lift. First, let's remember that dynamic flight involves using the wind that hits a mountain or a ridge and rises along its face. We use this upward wind by flying parallel to the mountain or cliff. On the other hand, in thermal flight, we take advantage of rising air currents known as thermals, which are generated by the heating of the ground. Certain areas on the ground heat up more than others, causing thermals to rise. The most efficient way to use these thermals is by making 360-degree turns within them, which we call spiraling into a thermal. Now, what happens when we have both wind and thermals? Usually, we can either stay close to the mountain to use dynamic wind lift or move away a bit to search for thermals. Depending on the flying area, one or the other may be more efficient. If you're taking off with little altitude, I recommend taking advantage of dynamic wind lift first, as it's easier to know where you can climb. Then, once you've gained a good amount of altitude, try searching for thermals, as these might be located away from the mountain. Sometimes these thermals stick close to the mountain and can be confused with the dynamic wind lift. This confusion leads many pilots to not know whether they are in a thermal or simply flying in dynamic wind lift. This creates uncertainty about whether to spiral or keep flying parallel to the mountain. Here are some tips to help you identify if you're ascending in a thermal or simply in dynamic wind lift. Tip 1. How far are you from the ocean? The ocean acts like a natural radiator, stabilizing the atmosphere. It's hard for thermals to form near the sea. If you're flying over a mountain or cliff by the ocean, forget about thermals and focus on dynamic flight. Tip 2. Time of day. Since thermals are created by temperature differences, the hottest hours of the day are when most thermals form. This is typically between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. During this time, the lift you're experiencing is more likely to be thermal rather than wind-generated. On the other hand, if you're flying in the late afternoon or near sunset, around 5 p.m. or 6 p.m., with cooler temperatures, conditions are probably more dynamic. Tip 3. Weather conditions. When the atmosphere is unstable, meaning the air temperature drops as you gain altitude, more thermals are likely to form. However, when the atmosphere is stable, meaning the air temperature doesn't drop with altitude, conditions are more dynamic. Usually, and I say usually because it doesn't always apply 100%, when we have cloudy and windy days, the atmosphere tends to be more stable and therefore more dynamic. On the other hand, when the day is sunny, warm, and less windy, the atmosphere tends to be more unstable, leading to more thermals. Tip 4. Lift location. Dynamic wind lift usually sticks close to the mountain. If you move away from it, you start losing height. This doesn't happen with a thermal. If you're flying close to the mountain, start climbing and move away. And instead of losing altitude, you keep climbing or even accelerate your rate of ascent. That's a good indicator you're in a thermal. Tip 5. Ascent rate. In paragliding, ascent rate is measured in meters per second. In dynamic wind flight, we typically climb steadily between 1 to 3 meters per second. However, in thermals, ascent rates can vary significantly, from 0 to 10 meters per second or even more, depending on the strength of the thermal. Within the same thermal, ascent rates can also vary based on the thermal's development stage and where you are within it. If you're flying steadily in dynamic wind and suddenly feel an increase in ascent rate that fluctuates, you might be in a thermal. Tip 6. Thermals help you spiral. When you're flying in a thermal and trying to spiral, which means making 360-degree turns inside it. The thermal itself helps you complete the turn, making it easier to spiral. It's almost like the thermal is pulling you into the turn. However, when attempting a 360-degree turn in dynamic wind, completing the turn becomes difficult, especially when flying with a tailwind towards the mountain. At that point, you might even feel like the brake isn't responding properly, and you begin to skid towards the mountain. This is why, in dynamic conditions, we only do 180-degree turns, flying in zigzags along the cliff or mountain, always turning away from the mountain. With all this said, if you're flying close to a mountain and suspect you've entered a thermal, you can try spiraling. If it feels easy and pleasant to complete a 360-degree turn while climbing, you're likely in a thermal. On the other hand, if spiraling doesn't help, your glider doesn't respond well, and you're not climbing, it was probably just dynamic wind lift, and you should avoid spiraling. And now, tell me, what other tricks do you have to recognize and spiral a thermal? Write it in the comments. Finally, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. Thank you very much for listening.